Hello, I'm Daniela. Today's video on slow stitching is an addendum to a previous video that I did on creating wonky stitch stripes for a block. Now in that video I said that you could take any closed shape, a square, a circle, anything like that, and stitch your wonky lines inside that block. Well, one viewer had a question about stitching flowers in that format. So flower shapes, but using wonky lines to fill them. Now when I started stitching those floral shapes, filling them with the wonky lines, I did discover a few little tips that will help the process be a little more concise and get more effective results. So here's my process for doing that. For our wonky stripes block, we took a block and filled it with a row of stripes. Now the stripes can go in any formation, up and down or across. I just happen to make them across. And it's a very interesting and effective piece because it's both a block or a shape that you make, as well as these lines. So it kind of gives the abstract look of a landscape. It's a fun way to fill in a shape other than just filling in a shape. And you can do this with any closed shape. And a closed shape is just a shape that all the lines close, so it can be circular or star-shaped or heart-shaped or floral-shaped. Here's where it's done with the hearts. So the purpose of this is you still see the heart in the overall shape, but it's made up of these wonky lines. Now if you notice here on this heart one, I filled it up with the solid color, just the single color. You could use multiple colors. Then you start getting into a little bit of tricky territory because depending on the shape that you make and how complicated that shape is, even though it's a closed shape, it can be distracting from the actual shape. So the simplest shapes, squares and circles, even hearts, are pretty basic. You can fill them with whatever colors you want, and pretty much multiple colors as well. So then a viewer had a question about, what about a closed shape flower? Because suddenly the shape becomes a little more complicated when it's a flower. So the best way to tackle that subject is to have a template just to envision what you're doing here. And so these are two of the same flowers, and these are two other flowers, but again, they're all closed shapes. So from here, to plan out and design your flower, you have to consider that you have an overall shape of the flower, but it's made up of multiple petals. So there are a few ways to go about doing this. You can create your shape and then fill it in with your wonky lines, just like we did in class, and then stitch each of those lines within those sketches that you've made. Now the key to doing this is to make sure that this line in between your rows isn't too large, so it's not too distracting, so that the eye sees the overall shape as well. And you can do this in multiple colors or a single color of thread. The same thing here, you can divide it up just in a few rows and create your shape. But what if you want to create the shape within the shape where you treat each of these petals as its own shape within that larger shape? Well, in that case, you just sketch out all the petals and then begin to treat each shape individually. Now, in order for it to look cohesive, you want your lines to kind of match up. So I would kind of draw shapes, they don't even have to be perfect, within the shapes, but they match up overall. So for this one, I might sew all my stitches on the outer portion of each of these petals the same color, just to make that match. And then for the next row, if I wanted to switch colors, I would switch it and do all of those next rows with that same secondary color. And then likewise, I do the final color here. Overall, it will still resemble a flower, but it will be treated individual petals because of the space between petals, as well as the space between the wonky lines. Now another way to do that as well, and this has far more petals, is to treat each petal individually yet again. You can even have a center that's hollow, and you bring all your petals to that center. So there's a lot of design work that you can consider. And now you can treat each petal individually. You can either stitch the wonky lines filling up each petal, And again, matching the initial design we have here. So all of my rows for all the petals would follow suit and match. You can do it all in a single color so it will match and be less distracting. Or, and I wouldn't do this on the same flower, but if we had another flower here, I would take this petal and I would divide it in half. And again, it doesn't have to be a straight line, it could be a wonky line, but I would stick to the same formation for each petal. So if I did the wonky line on one, I would do it on all of them. And likewise, if I did the straight line on one, I would do it on all of them. And then I would stitch on one side of that line. And again, I would stitch on that same side of that line for all of the petals that I choose. And if I wanted to use multiple colors, I could, as long as I kept them the same for each of the petals. And this way, the flowers would be cohesive and yet still recognizable as a flower and individual petals. And we'll show you what I mean. So I'm just going to make a quick sketch of a flower shape that's closed. I'm using my Frixion pen here, which with heat will erase. So when I'm done, I can really erase these lines and clean that up. And here I'll do a similar flower. Now I'll create a center here that I'm not going to stitch for both of them. And for this one, I'm going to divide my flower right in half. So I just divide each petal in half, and I'll stitch 2 colors for each petal. For this one, I'm going to stitch round wonky lines, concentric, and I'll just do 3 overall. And we're going to get these flowers to match up and yet look like flowers. So we'll start on the first one here, and I'm going to take just some dark teal thread, start at this bottom flower here, and I don't want too much space in between each of the rows. So I'll just stitch my flower, just using straight stitches, matching that shape of that line, and I'm going right to the edge of that drawing that we made, and just barely to the edge of that line, just short of that line. And I can make my stitches further apart or closer together, or a combination of both. And that's where the wonky stitches come in. If it's too wonky and too distracting, then I can always go back and fill them in. But I just like to have a little bit of space in between each of the stitches, and it really carves out the shape. I'll continue doing this all the way around this outer color, and this is going to be my darkest color. I think I'll do one more stitch in between here. And now I'll just start on my next petal, on the outer ring yet again. I'll knot off the back. Now I'm ready to start my next color. I'm going to take just a different shade of that teal. And again, I'll just start here on the next row, bringing my stitch up and just meeting it just shy of that first row of stitches we put in. And then I'll just continue all the way around yet again. Now what's key when doing these stitches is to fill in the area enough to make that section really noticeable as a single unit. So that's why I don't have a lot of space between the 2 different colored rows. If I was using a single color of thread, the space would be a little less important. I'd still want to make it tight to that first row, but the lack of difference of color would make up for it. And as you can see, the flower is starting to come together. It's recognizable as a floral shape. And now I just want to go in there with my final thread, and this I happen to choose as my lightest thread, and I'm going to just match up each of the petals. So I'm going to make sure that I leave a little gap between each petal, just of no stitches whatsoever. So it's kind of a negative image there to give that gap. And all my stitches are going to be brought right to that center ring. And that will leave a little negative space there as well for the center. Again, I'm just bringing my stitches up just shy of that next row. So there's my first petal. I have a little bit of a gap here that I want to correct, so I'll just go back in there and add another stitch. I just feel like that gap draws your eye to that point. So now I'm going to turn my piece around and start my next row. Again, I'm leaving a little gap between petals. So I'll knot the back and snip my thread. And now I'm ready to remove that marker that I put on as my sketch for my flower. Make sure the iron is nice and hot, and then I can remove those marks. And very effectively, you see a little bit of a wonky stitch flower. Now for my second flower, again, I'm going to treat each petal individually, and I'm just going to use 2 colors on each petal. So one thing I want to make sure that I really do is emphasize the shape of each petal. And I can do this by going in there and making that sketch. So I'm going to start with my lightest color, just because that's what I want to do. And I'll start with this petal down here. And I'm going to bring all my stitches up, right from the center, straight up. And again, I'm just doing a straight stitch. I'm going to follow the shape that I sketched out. Now some of my petals are uneven, but that's okay. It's a kind of the wonky stitches that I'm going for, and that wonky shape. What I want to really do is emphasize all the petals having the light color on the same side and all the stitches meeting in the middle. And as I get closer to the area where the petals meet, I'm going to be very careful and cautious about not bringing my stitch through that area that I marked, and that will give that little border that I'm looking for, that little natural border in between petals. So I'm going up and down, avoiding hitting the marker. So I have that one petal done. I'm going to switch to the next petal, and again, I'm going to do this side. I'm going to not do this side. I'm going to do that same side, and I'll do this all the way around all of the petals. So there I have all the stitches done, the same light color on the same side of each petal. I'll knot it off, and then I'll start with the darker color. So again, I want my stitches to meet at that center mark, but not cross over. I bring them all down in that same fashion, building up that shape of each petal, and actually just half of each petal. So there, I stitched the entire flower. I'll just knot off my thread on the back. and then remove any of that marker that remains. So I take my hot iron and just press off any of the marker. And here I'm left with my 2 flowers that I stitched. Now it's obvious that they're both flowers, the floral shapes that were made from these wonky rows of stitches. It's still a single flower, but you can see individual petals. Now there are other ways to do that, and I just wanted to show you a couple of variations. So this is the same technique we used here. The petals were a little smaller, and even though I used multiple colors, you could see the overall flower. Here I made wonky lines over the shape of the flower, and while it worked, it wasn't as effective as, say, this or the flowers we stitched today in the video. Here's another version of that, splitting the petal in half, stitching it, and it works quite well. And then here's one where I just stitched all the petals, just with kind of like a wonky stitch, a single stitch. I didn't even make stripes or rows. So these are different methods that you can use to make floral shapes, closed shapes, with your stitches. So that's how I created the floral wonky lines. It's kind of a fun way to use that technique of using stitches in either multiple colors or a single color to fill a shape, and yet you want it to be effective. The beauty of the flower and the floral shape is that you can treat it as the shape itself, a flower, or you can break it down to the individual petals. But either way, you want to keep that cohesive unit together so that the eye sees a recognizable flower shape. I hope this video was helpful. If you found it helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Thanks for joining me today.